Good afternoon, dear students. Today we will talk about sectional warping machine. In the last class we have studied about beam warping machine, and now we will study about sectional warping machine. So this comes under fabric manufacture 1 lab practice for the diploma in textile technology students in Sirisilla Government Polytechnic College. I am Shekhar Gaddam, lecturer in Sri Rajarajeshwara Swami Government Polytechnic, Rajanna, Sirisilla. So dear students, let us go to the sectional warping. What is the aim of the experiment? The aim of the experiment is to know the parts of the mechanism. There are 4 zones in the sectional warping machine. As we will be seeing in this video, there will be 4 zones in the sectional warping machine, and what are the parts of it and how they are combined together to form sectional warping machine, and how they work and construction, and all these things we will study in this. Principle of the experiment. Woven fabric is produced by the weaving process in the weaving mills. Sectional warping is an important process in these weaving mills. It is used to produce warp beams for weaving. So it is the preliminary process of weaving. I have already told you in the last class, which again I would like to repeat for the purpose of newcomers. So woven fabric is produced by the weaving process. Fabric is produced by weaving process, and preliminary process to weaving are winding, warping, sizing, looming, beaming. These are called as weaving preparatory processes. So weaving preparatory processes are winding, warping, sizing, beaming, and looming. So here in the warping comes after winding and before sizing. So warping is of 2 types: direct warping and indirect warping. Direct warping is called as beam warping, whereas indirect warping is called as sectional warping. So sectional warping is an important process in these weaving mills. Nowadays sectional warping machine is very predominant in the various weaving mills because it produces beams, weavers beams for weaving, and this is one of the preliminary processes of weaving. The sectional warping machine prepares multicolored warps to be woven as striped or checked design fabrics. It is additionally used for double grey or monocolored warps that do not require sizing. So here we are getting into the subject. The sectional warping is used for multicolored warps. For monocolored warps, beam warping is used, as I told you in the last class. For monocolored warps or grey colored warps or single colored warps, direct warping or beam warping is used. So sectional warping is used where multicolored warps are present. are required. Multicolored warps to be woven as striped or checked design fabrics. Striped or checked design fabrics. It is additionally used for doubled gray or monocolor warps that do not require sizing. So here it is used where there is no sizing is required. In that case also it is used. Unlike the beam or direct warping, where a warper's beam is manufactured and sent to the consequent sizing process, in the case of sectional warping, the weaver's beam is manufactured and hence does not require sizing. So this is in the direct or beam warping, the warper's beams are sent to sizing, but in the sectional warping machine, the weaver's beam itself is manufactured and hence they do not require sizing. In the case of single yarns that are multicolored, the yarns are sized and then coiled on the sectional warp beam. The yarn is wound on sections, each section having a particular width. This is one of the important point of the sectional warping. And in the case of single yarns that are multicolored, the yarns are sized and then coiled onto the sectional warp beam. The yarn is wound in sections. So here in sectional warping, each yarn is the warp yarn is divided into sections. So each section has a particular width, and therefore this way it is coiled onto the sectional warp beam. The yarn is wound in sections and each section having particular width. So just I have browsed through the material what is there, so that it will be easy for me to go through the topics. So construction continued. Thus the total number of warp ends for the weaver's beam is arranged into a suitable number of sections on a warping drum. The sections are then consolidated to form the weaver's beam. Therefore, there are two separate operations involved, namely warping and beaming. So I want to tell you one more time. Beam warping is direct warping. Sectional warping is indirect warping. Why is it called as indirect warping? Because here warping is done and then beaming is done, like it is said in the fourth point. So thus the total number of warp ends for the weaver's beam is arranged into a suitable number of sections on a warping drum. The sections are then consolidated to form the weaver's beam. Therefore, there are two separate operations, namely warping and beaming. That's what I told you. So please understand that total number of warp ends for the weaver's beam is arranged in a suitable number of sections. Suppose total number of warp ends are 2400 ends and it is divided into 6 sections of 400 each. So these 400 each sections are consolidated to form the weaver's beam, and after that warping is done, and so like that 400 400 400 of different colors, 6 different colors, and they are wound onto the warping drum, and after that from there it is beamed onto the next beaming operation. So please observe, this is the sectional warping machine. So this is the yarn from the creel. It passes through reed and then guide rollers and then stop motion, and then through the lease reed, and then after that V reed, and then onto the wooden section block. So this is the sectional warping machine. So please observe, yarn from the creel, so that comes from the back reed. If you observe this diagram, there are 3 kinds of reed in this diagram: back reed, lease reed, and V reed. Please observe, back reed is the position where from the creel the yarn is drawn through the back reed, and then it moves on to the guide rollers, and thread guide and tensioning devices are present on the and stop motion is also present on the each cone that is present, and then guide rollers, stop position, and then lease reed where the yarns are separated from each other, and then passes through the V reed. This is another kind of reed, and then after that it passes through wooden section block. This is known as passage of yarn through the machine. Passage of yarn through the sectional warping machine. So please see this diagram. So the big sectional warping drum, that is known as the tapered drum, warping drum, that is known as sectional warping drum. So on that, with the help of adjustable reed, and then it is then wound in sections on this big drum, warping drum. So this is the actual picture of the sectional warping machine. So this is the schematic diagram of sectional warping machine, and you have seen the actual warping machine. Picture of the warping machine. So now we will go through the passage of material. Passage of material. The supply packages are in the form of cones or cheeses. They are placed on a V-shaped creel or a semicircular creel, depending upon whether stop motion is used or not. The yarn from the creel moves through the back reed. The reed controls the uniform spacing of the yarn throughout the width of the warp. So these 2 points I have explained already, but because of it came again, I will explain again. The supply packages. So what are the supply packages? They are cones or cheeses. Whether it is direct warping or indirect warping, The supply packages are cones or cheeses. Where they are placed? They are placed on a V-shaped creel or a semicircular creel depending upon whether stop motion is used or not. So if stop motion is used or not, depending on that, V creel or semicircular creel are used. In the direct warping we have seen V creel, rectangular creel and magazine creel are used. Here also we see that V-shaped creel or semicircular creel are used. Second point, the yarn from the creel moves through the back reed. So the yarn moves from the creel. The yarn from the creel moves through the back reed. I have shown you in the diagram here. This is the back reed. So please observe yarn from the creel and back reed. So the yarn from the creel moves through the back reed. The reed controls the uniform spacing of the yarn. What is the purpose of the reed? It controls the uniform spacing of the yarn throughout the width of the warp. The reed controls the uniform spacing of the yarn. The reed controls the uniform spacing of the yarn throughout the width of the warp. This is so to maintain equidistance from the yarns from each other, and this is maintained throughout the width of the warp. So that is the purpose of the back reed. So in the 2 points we have seen the supply packages are in the form of cones or cheeses, and these cones or cheeses are placed on a V-shaped creel or a semicircular creel, and after that the yarn from the creel passes through back reed. The reed controls the uniform spacing of the yarn throughout the width of the warp. So those 2 points are completed. Next, passage of material, third point. Then the yarn moves over and under the guide and drop rollers. The drop rollers impart tension to the yarn passing under them and hold the yarn tight when the machine is passed. Then the yarn moves over under the guide rollers. So it moves over the guide rollers, which impart tension to the yarn passing under them and hold the yarn tight when the machine is passed. So they maintain the uniform tensioning of the warp yarn. The guide rollers are used to maintain the uniform tension of the warp, and then they hold the yarn tight. From there the yarn goes through a stop motion device. So the fourth point is, after that the yarn goes through a stop motion device which stops the machine in the event of an end breakage in the supply package or getting exhausted. Excuse me. So from the guide rollers the yarn goes through a stop motion device. So what is a stop motion device? In case of warp yarn breakage, the machine is stopped automatically and the worker or operator comes for mending the brake, and after mending the brake the machine is restarted. So this is the purpose of stop motion. So fourth point is from the guide rollers. From there the yarn goes through a stop motion device which stops the machine in the event of an end breakage in the supply package or getting exhausted. So there are two cases, whether there is a breakage, an end breakage, or the supply package, it may get exhausted. What does it mean by exhaustion of the supply package? The complete emptying of the supply package. All the warp yarn on the supply package is exhausted, is completed. Then there will be bare supply package without the warp yarn. In that case, the supply package, the bare empty supply package is taken out and the new full supply package is placed over the creel and the machine is restarted again. So this is known as stop motion function. From the stop motion, fifth point, from the stop motion device the yarn moves through a leasing reed. The yarn moves through a leasing reed. The reed is to form an end lease at the start and completion of each section. The depth of the reed is comparatively much more than that of the common reed. Each end of the warp passes separately inserted in the warp after one section of warp and the reed is lowered. This is a tricky point. So from the stop motion device, the yarn moves through a leasing reed. Leasing reed separates the warp yarn. The reed is to form an end lease at the start and completion of the each section. So it forms one section. Leasing reed creates a section and each section is completed. So here in the sectional warping machine, we wound the warp yarn onto the big warping drum in sections. The depth of the reed is comparatively much more than that of the common reed. Each end of the warp passes separately inserted in the warp after one section of the warp and the reed is lowered. So this is how sections are formed on the warping drum working. So we have started around 7:45. So anyway, timing is also important factor in video lessons. So I am just checking out the timing. So working. From the stop motion device, the yarn moves through a leasing reed. So this is the same point. The reed is to form an end lease reed at the start and completion of each section. The depth of the reed is comparatively much more than that of the common reed. Each end of the warp passes separately inserted in the warp after one section of warp and the reed is lowered. The purpose of this leasing is to wind and unwind the warp without any entanglement between threads and to distribute evenly. It also helps the yarn maintain in position and helps to detect the broken end and mend it properly. So the purpose of the leasing is to wind and unwind the warp without any entanglement between threads. So I will explain about this entanglement. This is known as one warp yarn is mixed or intertwined with the other warp yarn. Then this causes entanglement. Entanglement not only disturbs one yarn but it also disturbs the surrounding yarns. 2 to 3 to 4 yarns will be disturbed and then it will result in breakages. So unwind the warp without any entanglement between threads and to distribute evenly. So the leasing reed separates the warp yarns so that the warp yarns do not entangle with each other. So that there won't be any entanglement between the yarns and the yarns are distributed evenly. So the leasing rod function is to distribute the yarns, warp yarns evenly and avoid entanglement. It also helps the yarn maintain. So the leasing lead also helps the yarn maintain in its position and helps to detect the broken end and mend it properly. So this leasing reed helps in detecting the broken ends. There will be broken ends in case of sectional warping or any machine operation. The yarns may break at any time and the leasing reed will detect the broken ends. And it will detect the broken ends and then they mend it properly. Who will mend it? The operator, the warper will mend the broken ends and then it is restarted again. After mending the machine, it is restarted again. The yarn next passes through a V-reed, enabling the warp's width through it to be adjusted according to the width of the sections to be made. So the warp yarn passes through a V-reed. After passing through the leasing reed, it passes through a V-reed, enabling the warp's width through it to be adjusted according to the width of the sections to be made. So the purpose of V-reed is to create sections so that the width of each section will be as per the width of the total width and the number of sections and the number of sections and width of each section and the total width of the machine. So this is the purpose of V-reed. This is enabled by the V-reed. So the yarn next passes through a V-reed, enabling the warp's width through it to be adjusted according to the width of the sections to be made. Then the yarn passes over a measuring roller and is wound on a wooden block called swift. So the wooden block is known as swift. After winding the predetermined length of warp, leasing is carried out. The sections of threads are continued to the swift in bunch form. So then the yarn passes over a measuring roller and is wound on a wooden block called swift. After winding the predetermined length of warp, the sections of threads are continued to the swift in a bunch form. So we have to see that leasing reed and then we read, and then there will be a measuring roller and then after that a wooden block called swift is present. So after a predetermined length of warp of one section is wound, then it is continued to the swift in a bunch form, and then next section is getting ready. So this is important point. After winding the predetermined length of warp, suppose one section red color or green color or whatever color each section, because sectional warping is used for multicolored warps. So in this case the predetermined length, suppose 4000 meters is predetermined length. After it is wound, then this is sent to the continued to the swift in a bunch form, and then so next section will be getting ready. After that next section, so the sectional warping is done. This is the major point in sectional warping. The multicolored warps are wound onto the sectional warping drum section wise. Each section is done, and then next section, and then next section. Next, the section is wound in the side of the previous one. The exact process is continued until the required numbers of sections are made on the wooden swift. Then all the sections are taken and transferred to a beam using the running of machine. The beam is driven by a motor or manually. The section width may vary from 10 centimeters to 20 centimeters. So this is what I told you just now. The exact process is continued until the required numbers of sections are made on the wooden swift. Suppose 2400 ends are there and each end is 400 meters. So in that way, so 6 sections: green, red, blue, yellow, orange, white, black. Suppose like that. So then first green color 400 meter 400 red color warp yarns are wound onto the section, and after that violet color, after that orange color, 400 400 400. So like that each section, all the sections are wound onto the wooden swift. After all the sections are wound onto the wooden swift or wooden drum, then all the sections are taken and transferred to a beam using the running of machine. The beam is driven by a motor or manually. So the beam is driven by a motor or manually. The section width may vary from 10 centimeters to 20 centimeters. Merits. Merits means advantages. The sectional warping machine has the following advantages. It is suitable for striped warp yarn. It is suitable for striped warp yarn. So different colors of warp are introduced in sections and they may be introduced in a striped pattern. The labor charge is not so high. For sectional warping machine, the labor charge is not very high because whole machine is highly sophisticated and labor has not much work to do, so labor cost will be very less. Low power is required to drive the machine. Low horsepower is required to drive the machine. There is no sizing process. Sizing process is not there. That's what he says. But let me see again afterwards and we will see. Demerits. There are two stages, namely warping and beaming. Here, warping is done on sectional warping drum, and then after that it is wound onto the beam. So this is known as warping and beaming. Warp will have to be dyed, sized, dried separately by slow and expensive processes before warping, because after the sectional warping there is no sizing process, so it has to be dyed, sized and dried separately by slow and expensive process before warping. Before warping itself it has to be dyed, sized, dried. All these processes have to be completed so that warping is done perfectly. Third point, some amount of size will be removed from the warp during the process of sectional warping. So some amount of the size will be removed from the warp during the process of sectional warping. In the sectional warping machine, some amount of size will be removed. So this is the sectional warping machine that we have seen. So you see that there is a big sectional warping drum. You see the tapered, the diameter is higher at the left end, and then after that it is uniform parallelly diameter. So the black color one is known as V reed, and so there will be measuring roller, and this is how sections are wound onto the sectional warping machine. So we have studied sectional warping machine in length and in detail. Direct warping is also called as beam warping. Direct warping is used for single monocolored filaments, whereas indirect warping or sectional warping is used for multicolored. Please remember, if you forget everything that's fine, but just remember the simple difference between beam warping and sectional warping. Beam warping is for single colored gray colored warp yarn, whereas sectional warping is for multicolored. I am telling you one more time. Beam warping is for monocolored warp yarn. Sectional warping is for multicolored warp yarn. This is the only difference, main difference. The whole process is approximately the same. Beam warping is for monocolored, multicolored. Monocolored beam warping, multicolored sectional warping. Okay, let's go to the video now and then we can conclude the session afterwards. So here another section is introduced. We got thread guide. This is the screen. This is beaming. Till now warping is done. Now it will be beaming will be done. This is a weaver beam. Prepare. These are the specifications of the weaver beam. Taken a printout and given to them. The seller. So, dear students, we have seen an excellent video of sectional warping, and thank you. We will see in the next class.